those of you new to ITSM Academy, here's a quick overview. We developed all content in-house. That includes all IDLE education as well as process design, Agile, and DevOps. Since 2003, we've trained and certified tens of thousands of students. Now let's introduce today's speakers. Perry leads the SRE squad for the IBM Bluemix continuous delivery offering. His background is in application development, outside-in design, and IT operations. Richie is a senior technical staff member with IBM Bluemix DevOps Services and lead architect for SRE. He has a background in developer tools and team collaborations. Good morning, Richie. Good morning, Perry.
Good morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Perry, would you like me to make you the presenter?
Yes, ma'am, please.
All righty. We're very excited about your presentation today.
Great. Can you see my screen now?
I can. It's perfect. Thank you.
Great. So, again, my name is Perry Statham, and I have my colleague Richie Shocker here on the phone with me. And we'll skip past the introductions because Karen did a fine job introducing us there. So we've got the the chat going, and I'm just curious as I go through this. Mention in the chat if this sounds familiar to you. Once upon a time, there were two teams in a large company. One of the teams developed software products. The other team hosted instances of those products. The development team would send packages over to the operations team, and the operations team would go, what? And back to the development team. And the cycle would repeat and repeat, causing they were kind of going through a wall of confusion is what, the DevOps term for it. And this kind of happens a lot, and so then along came DevOps. Yay. DevOps is where the teams are much more cooperative. They built, the same team. You can kind of think of them as the same team. They build it, they deploy it, they run it, they manage it. Solved a lot of problems, huge improvement, but there's lots of questions still, right? How do we balance our change velocity, like from our development work, versus our availability, our reliability, our security, all the other kind of ilities or operational ilities attributes that we're familiar with, especially from like IDLE, right? How do we fix a bug, do we fix a bug in the UI, or do we fix a bug that makes the back end have to be restarted every once in a while? Do we, add a great new feature, or do we automate our backups? Do we improve our app's performance, or do we reduce its mean time to recovery? Do we improve deployment automation, or do we improve standards compliance? All these things have to be balanced. And then especially when, DevOps kind of goes through the concept of relatively small squads, and it's a process. So when each squad is doing its own DevOps process, how do we encourage consistency and discipline with our processes? How do we scale those specialized reliability engineering skills? How do we avoid incident response burnout? How do we do a lot of the stuff that enterprise companies really need to do, right? You can't ignore these kinds of questions. Last year, the book Site Reliable Engineering, and which I'm going to call the Google book here, was published by O'Reilly. This book is actually Creative Commons. There is a link to it in the reference slide at the bottom. Or you can just, you can literally Google Site Reliable Engineering, and one of the first hits will be to the book. And so it's very useful. We highly recommend it. The next set of slides, I'm going to be mostly summarizing what is SRE and kind of the core concepts, core principles and tenets from it, with lots of quotes and so forth. One of the some of these quotes, I'll just go ahead and read them. It's a specific implementation. You can think of it as a specific implementation of DevOps with some idiosyncratic extensions. SRE teams are responsible for availability, latency, performance, efficiency, change management, monitoring, emergency response, otherwise known as incident management, capacity planning, so forth. I love this quote from Ben Sloss, who answers, well, what is SRE as it's become at Google? It's SRE is what happens when you ask a software engineer to design an operations team. Okay, so the next few slides, I'm going to go through principles and tenets, and then after that, Richie is going to take it and kind of describe how we adopted SRE within our organization. First of all, one of the key principles, and these kind of build on each other through the slides, is the principles of indicators, service level indicators, service level objectives, and service level agreements. I know that I've always kind of thought of, we need to beat our SLA, right? And we do need to meet our SLA, but as we kind of adopt SRE, it's really the indicators and objectives that we need to shoot for, right? The objectives are where we want to be, where we want our indicators to be. The agreements are, well, what's it going to cost us if we don't meet our objectives, right? There's a couple of lessons learned here. Well, not really lessons learned, but coming from the body of knowledge. Percentiles generally work better than aggregations when you're doing your indicators, and when you're identifying indicators, don't pick more than a handful. These are generally things that you're going to put up on a graph. Think about things that you would want to show on the big screen in your squad room, right? Not every metric makes a good SLI. You're going to have, most organizations that I've worked with have hundreds of metrics, lots and lots and lots of metrics. You might want to, when you're identifying indicators, you might want to combine some of those metrics. You might want to pick the ones that are just really representative of your service level. The next principle is embrace risk, and this will be actually a common thing. Your goal in SRE is to explicitly align the risk taken by given service with the risk the business is willing to bear. Okay, and when you're thinking about risk and you think about metrics, think about what makes a good metric for this. Okay, and what represents your risk. Is your metric time-based? Is it, in other words, is it uptime versus your percentage uptime? Is it your percentage of successful requests? Is it something else? And as you're evaluating risk, one another principles or in SRE is error budgets. Okay, error budgets balance the goal. And this is one of the things that I really like about SRE is it becomes an engineering exercise. Error budgets balance the goals of your development teams versus your SRE teams. If your an error budget is defined as your it's basically what's left over after you've reached your objective, right? It's 100% minus your SLO. So if your error budget, if your objective is 99.95, then your error budget is 0.05%. One of the kind of the eye openers for me, that those aha moments as I was learning about SRE, is that the goal is not zero outages, right? The goal is to meet your SLO and then spend your error budget the way you need to, right? So if you've blown your error budget from accidental outages or whatever, then you don't have any error budget for like releasing new features, right? So anyway, so that's just, you know, once you've kind of, you know, your error budget is the definition of yes or no. If we've blown our error budget, then you can't release. You know, you have to work on, you know, improve your availability. If you've not blown your error budget, then sure, let's go ahead and do our release, you know, of the new feature. And all that can be automated. If we have our error budget, right, then you can automate whether something is released or not. Emphasizing the importance of error budgets in SRE. There's a couple of great quotes. I'm not going to read them from Ben Traynor. This was in an interview that he did in kind of in a blog format. It's posted. I have a link to it in there. But basically, it's emphasizing, you know, don't shoot for 100%. Shoot for whatever makes sense for your business, and then use what's left over for your releases and so forth. Okay, another key principle in SRE is to eliminate toil. We want to spend time on engineering work rather than operational work, right? We want to reduce the manual, mundane, repetitive work that doesn't, you know, each instance of it doesn't produce endearing value. You know, that is a linear scale as your service grows. Reducing toil and scaling up services is the engineering part of site reliability engineering. I love this quote from one of the Google SREs. If a human operator needs to touch your system during normal operations, you have a bug. Definition of normal operations changes as your systems grow. Another principle, know what's wrong and why. If you can't monitor service, then you don't know what's happening. And if you're blind to what's happening, then you can't be reliable. Monitoring in itself is a complex thing. I'm probably preaching to the choir on this one, right? It's, you know, monitoring can be hard. Monitoring should answer the questions, what's wrong? Why is it wrong? One of the things that I think I knew, but SRE kind of brought it home to me, is let's use the right output, right? Oh, you know, only send alerts if a human needs to take immediate action. Don't open a ticket if a human needs to take that action, but it can be done in the morning or the next business day, right? Use logs to record what you need for diagnostics. Metrics are useful for overall system operation. I'm kind of going back to SLIs here, but do not sorry. Metrics that are useful for overall system operation but do not influence major user interactions are not usually your SLIs, right? If it's a, you know, your disk space is getting low, well, first of all, that's probably a ticket, not an alert, right? And it doesn't directly affect your user's interaction, right? So that's probably not the best. You know, disk metrics are probably, if you have a web application, disk metrics are probably not good SLIs. Another thing that kind of came home to me, and I've been guilty of this, of sending alerts or even tickets that are that require, you know, digging in to understand them, right? And this comes directly from the book. A system that requires a human to read an email and decide whether or not some type of action needs to be taken is fundamentally flawed. Monitoring should never require a human to interpret any part of the alert. Software should do the interpreting, and humans should only be notified when they need to take action. When I was doing this this presentation internally with our internal teams, it wasn't named stuff happens. There was a little bit stronger word, but regardless, be prepared, right? Stuff is going to happen, so be prepared to handle it. Reduce your repair time. Reliability is a function of your mean time to failure and mean time to repair. The most relevant metric is in evaluating your incident management, your emergency response, is how quickly the team can bring the system back to business as usual, back to health. Another thing that is that I think a lot of us already know, but is called out in the book, and kind of raise your awareness, is every time you have to have a human involved in that repair time, then that's going to add your latency. And if you add your latency, then you risk blowing your error budget. So a lot of us think, okay, well, let's just automate everything. Let's just automate. And that is a good mantra, but you need to be careful, right? It's not a panacea. It can hide systematic problems. It can do the wrong thing, or even a damaging thing because of a poor design or implementation. Remember, garbage in, garbage out. I love this quote again. If we're engineering processes and solutions that are not automatable, we continue having to staff humans to maintain the system. If we have to staff humans to do the work, we are feeding the machines with the blood, sweat, and tears of human beings. Think the Matrix with less special effects and more pissed off system administrators. Kind of brings it home for me. Reliable releases. Okay, so this kind of makes the assumption, it's a DevOps assumption, that you're going to be doing continuous delivery, continuous release. And so reliable services require that your release processes also be reliable. Continuously build and deploy, do automated check gates, do A/B deployments, other methods for checking sanity. Don't be afraid to roll back, especially if you're in an SRE role, right? So say something it did go all the way through, right, into your production system, and a few hours later, the world ended or whatever. Something happened to, some bug got crept into the system. It got through all the check gates, and nobody caught it. Roll it back. Be prepared to roll it back, right? Don't be afraid to do that, and send it back to the dev team or the team that produced it and say, hey, you got a bug, or it didn't work. Be quick. Let it go quick. Even automate your rollbacks, right? Treat your configuration as code. Basically, use engineering to manage configuration. A lot of times, especially as you're starting out, the tendency is to manually configure everything, right? If you need to change something, you go in and change it. Well, think again. Make that configuration a piece of code. Write a program to change that option or whatever. Check that code, your configuration code, into your version control system. Review it, check it, test it, do change management on it, right? The more you can treat your configuration as code, the more quickly you can scale. Automate your deployment of that configuration, just like you automate deployment of your services or your applications. Automate the configuration of deployment as well. Keep it simple. I love this quote: the price of reliability is the pursuit of the utmost simplicity. There's two types of complexity. There's essential complexity that is inherent to your problem definition. There's accidental complexity that is fluid and can be resolved with engineering. SREs, and part of the SRE's job is to minimize accidental complexity. Push back when it's introduced, strive to eliminate it, Review code, right? Every new line of code is liability. Promote practices and make that code, make sure that code has essential purposes. Remove dead code. SREs are engineers. They're not just operators. So dig into the code. Okay, so we're about 20 minutes in, and Karen, I'm going to pass it over to Richie, and actually I think I'm going to drive the slides while Richie narrates.
Okay, perfect.
All right, thanks for the setup and context setting, Perry. So for the next part of this, what we're going to do is tell our story about how we looked at the SRE model and we adopted it within our organization in IBM DevOps Services. So just a quick disclaimer, IBM's a huge company. There's lots of different teams deploying lots of different services on the cloud. And there's levels of autonomy within those teams, using different sets of tools and following different processes and methodologies. So what we're describing is what worked for our team, delivering a handful of services. The other thing that disclaimer I'll put out, the slides that follow were originally designed for an hour-long presentation at SRECon, so I may go a little fast. As Perry pointed out, the slides and a video recording of that full presentation with my co-presenter at the time, Rob Orr, is available on the SRECon 17 site. So if you like what you see and you'd like, to see the full version, it's there. Okay. So what essentially happened with us is that we had been planning to put together an SRE team for a while, and there were some discussions being made around organizational changes and staffing, and they had an architect lined up who at the last minute changed his mind on the opportunity to go work on something else. They asked me to step in and on very short notice, and I agreed and said yes. And then immediately, we were in a situation where there were very high expectations from multiple stakeholders, from VPs to development managers, technical leads, and everyone had a different view or a lot of confusion about what our role and purpose and mission was. And so it was a bit of a challenge at first just to manage folks' expectations and to codify, what we were doing and why we were doing it and who's, what the roles and responsibilities were and what people should be expecting from an SRE team. So what follows here is sort of a lessons learned, and how would we do it differently if we could start all over and do it again, and that's where this staged approach comes in. So just to be clear, this is not meant to be a waterfall approach, but it is meant to be taken in some level of order, and you get a particular stage to a place where you're able to start moving forward, and then you move on to the next stage, but while continuing to iterate along the way, and starting small and gradually scaling up. So as your maturity improves, you should be able to increase the scale of and scope of what you're doing, and add more people, and over time you'll see improvements to both the impact you're having to the organization as well as your development velocity. So the 4 stages, we'll go through each of these 4 stages in some detail. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So the first one, and some of these principles are true when you're starting any new endeavor, right? But it is define what your scope is, and make sure that you have who your stakeholders are, and make sure that you have your buy-in. So identify who your leadership team is going to be. In this case for us, it was our technical leads, the service managers and incident managers, and architect. Also, start defining which of these leads will become subject matter experts in the individual services that your team supports. Define what your values are. Define the roles and responsibilities, and that's just really clearly, spelling out what is SRE doing, what's Dev doing. For example, SRE is not your level 1 support team, taking help tickets. That still belongs to development. And SRE is not your your system test team. We may implement test frameworks and chaos testing and that sort of thing, but we're not taking over development teams or service teams testing. Those are just a couple of examples, but what we do is we manage their incident management RCA process and call out rotations and those sorts of things. Define what your benchmarks are going to be, so scorecards and checklists. And again, in our case, we had multiple stakeholders. We had executives and development managers to please, and our executives really wanted very quickly for us to be able to say, what's my risk? How mature is this particular service, and should I let them, push new changes out into production and make announcements on this? And so we had to define, well, what is the scorecard going to be? What are the criteria that we're going to look at, and how are we going to measure that? And again, having that sort of thing up front, before we start adding a bunch of people, can be helpful. What promotion gates do you have and approvals for allowing deployments? And then once you get these things written out, then it's time to do your roadshow. Make sure you sit down to do separate reviews with your executives, with the service managers, with the service tech leads, take their input, refine, and get everyone to say, yes, got it, we agree. Next slide, please. So what follows is just a couple of examples, not necessarily a recipe for how any organization should do it, but we sat down, we came up with a core set of values for our team, particularly because in our experience, what happened was we had a team that was a traditional operations team that was supporting development squads that were practicing DevOps to a pretty high extent. But our operations folks were still very much in the operations mindset, doing, lots of manual tasks and toil. And so as a part of this, we needed to change our culture, change our approach to how we're doing things, and reinforcing the fact with everyone, we are an engineering team, and the things that we do shape the direction, the strategic direction of the business, that we have an influence on the outcomes. If our measurements and our gap analysis show that there are serious problems in parts of our offering, then that may impact the prioritization that's coming out from the development leads. And we partner together with the service team. So I don't say the development team, I say the service team, because again, this is not a dev and ops split. This is service teams with an SRE team that augments it. And so as part of that, our SREs are expected to know how our services work, how to use them, how to set up development environments, what the architecture looks like, and first and foremost, what is the customer experience? And we do everything we can to discourage an us versus them mindset. We're here to help partner with development. Their goals are our goals and vice versa. And we align our priorities. And we also respect the fact that the service squads are autonomous to the extent that they can be. We have, consistency in processes and promotion gates and how we measure the maturity of a service, but within those parameters, what architecture they use, whether it's Java or Node, if they're using containers or platform as a service applications, those are decisions that are left to the service squads to decide. And then again, defining the roles and responsibilities clearly. This is just an example of the SRE responsibilities that we defined. In addition, defining exactly what is the expectation from development is important as well. We won't go through all of these. I don't know that we have time, but the important thing for us was to have that written out, make sure that people understood this is what SRE is going to provide for you. The one key point here is that at the bottom, decisions and recommendations of the SRE team are independent of functional or date commitments. So there's always going to be business pressure to hit your dates, to deliver on things that have been promised or committed, and those things happen at development. Our motto is we report the facts. So a part of our job is to make sure that we are doing a thorough job on our gap analysis and scorecards, that we're doing a thorough job on measuring and reporting the availability of our services, and that we're making that information available to executives and dev leaders, that they can then make appropriate decisions moving forward. So you've defined your mission, you've defined your scope, you've worked it out with your stakeholders, you've gotten some general buy-in. Now it's time to take a look at what are you going to be focusing on, right? So for us, we needed to do a fresh review of what were all the tools, the processes we were doing, and put together a backlog and groom that backlog and make sure that we had consistency, or look at places where perhaps we need to change tools and change processes. So tracking and planning, we follow an agile development process. We meet regularly with our stakeholders and we review our backlog and we get their input in terms of how we should be prioritizing. Monitoring and availability reporting, we use a combination of cloud-hosted monitoring systems as well as our internal tools for both black box and white box testing and monitoring, which then feeds a data series that we can then chart in Grafana, as shown here in the blurred image, that can then be used to report on our availability. Recovery procedures, aka runbooks, and automation. That's, what do the first responders need to look at if they get an alert, and what are their next actions that they need to take. Incident management, what happens when there is a system outage or a system failure and you have to get the right SMEs on the phone and start digging in and try to get service restored. And it's important, Perry talked a little bit about your time to recover. Having an effective incident management process and knowing how to get people online as quickly as possible is critical to keeping that time to recovery as low as possible. And then after an incident, the root cause analysis, making sure that those are adequately conducted and that action items come out of as a result of that, and that there's traceability and accountability, that those action items are actually followed through with and reported on. So we have a rule within our own team that an RCA has to be completed within 2 weeks. Because you don't want, if you're getting woke up in the middle of the night, you don't necessarily want to do the RCA right after the system was restored, because most people at that point, they just want to go back to bed. But you do want to have that RCA in a pretty timely manner after the incident, so that while it's fresh on people's minds, and that you can identify what were all the causes. In some cases it may be process, in some cases it may be, well, we were missing information in the run books, the first responder could have fixed this. It could be that the problem was we didn't know who the SME was to get on the phone to help us with this, or it could be a problem in the code where some additional resiliency needs to be added. But the action items that come out of those RCAs range the full gamut. What tools you're using for deployment, test automation, and test and reporting test results, and code coverage, and collaboration. So there, we use a persistent chat tool, Slack, and we use it quite heavily, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in one of the subsequent slides. In fact, in this one. So this is just another example of an incident operation model. So over on the left, you have the monitoring sources that, again, are polling the applications either through hitting a combination of system health API endpoints on individual microservices, as well as what we would call consumption or synthetic or more user-facing tests, where we actually have monitoring tests that go through a sequence of operations that simulate or replicate of what a user would experience on the site. And if those monitors fail, then it sends events into the event management system, and then from there, there's a process for actually, doing correlation on those particular events and filtering to determine is there really a problem or not. And the call, it would then get routed to our technical operations center where we have first responders. First responders will look at the problem, determine if, check the run books, determine if there's something that they can do about it. If they can't, then they'll do what we say, call a SWAT. And so for that, we also have a page out rotation tool that we use. We use PagerDuty, and we have all the on-call people on an 8-day rotation, and they would get called out. But one key point here is that we view our TOC not always as the first line of defense, but as the last line of defense, because the collaboration tool over here on the right is capturing all of this information. So we want a system and process that goes to where the development and the engineers are. And so, everyone's using Slack. It's a natural tool for them. That's where they go for information. They poor email and prefer to do things in Slack. So we actually have dedicated channels for, dedicated channels for monitoring the health of our services and for routing alerts when a particular monitoring test fails. And so during business hours, you'll find that the squad leaders or the SRE engineers are actually watching the channels, and they see the problem even before the TOC has done any kind of call out. And then it also provides a communication channel. So if people want to know, well, what's going on with production? I'm seeing some issues right now. I'm having trouble logging in. They can go look in the Slack channel, and everyone can play along and see what's going on. Not only that, the Slack channel then provides us transcript. If there was an actual outage incident, then we record everything that we're doing, everything that we're trying. If we had to restart something, we had to check a log, we had to go file an external ticket, whatever it was, it all goes into the chat transcript, which then helps us formulate the timeline later for the root cause analysis. I think enough on that one. Let's go to the next chart. Yeah, so just a continuation on the tools, processes, and backlog. Decide what you're going to do for tracking and planning. First, we use GitHub issues and ZenHub Kanban boards. Very lightweight and simple. It doesn't really matter what tracking and planning tool that you use. It's just important to have one and to practice Agile and turn everything into a backlog. If it's, decide what monitoring framework we're going to use, then that becomes an epic that we file that says, decide what monitoring framework to use, and so on and so forth. So some of the things that we were talking about in the previous charts, those can become backlog items. And then at that point, once you have a backlog, then it's easier to review that and determine what the prioritization of that is going to be. Enough on backlog. Let's keep going. Next chart, please. So then at this point, you've gotten the stakeholder buy-in, you've defined the tools and processes, you've stubbed out a backlog, you've got your technical leads. Now it's time to build out the team and organize it. And one key decision point is, how are you going to staff this? You may be under budget constraints. Do you have the luxury of being able to bring in new hires? Or is this something where you have to do a rotational model? In our case, we chose a combination of both, but we did lean heavily on the rotational model, where we actually pulled engineers out of the service squads for rotational stints. It's not necessarily a permanent position for them to come and do SRE, but we want everyone to rotate into SRE for some period of time, and then they can rotate back into the service development squad working on features. And it's to make sure that everyone has a little bit of skin in the game. But it's important if you're doing the rotational model to make sure that the people that we're bringing in, have the right set of skills and the right experience in order to accomplish our mission successfully. In our case, we also organized both vertically and horizontally. So there are a number of different services that we support and manage, and so we wanted to have our individuals become SMEs in the individual services, but then we also have what you would call a horizontal or a guild, where we organize by discipline. So for example, monitoring as a discipline, making sure that we're consistent in how we're doing monitoring across all the various services. Security is another example. And we try as much as possible to make sure that we don't have what I would refer to as human single points of failure. So everybody talks about, well, what are we going to do if Bob gets hit by a bus? I like to say, what are we going to do if Bob wins the lottery? Because winning the lottery is a lot more fun than getting hit by a bus. But making sure that we have redundancy and high availability in our skills is as important as having redundancy and high availability in our architectures in general. And we want to make sure we have the proper domain expertise, that we understand the architecture and the topology of the services that we support, how to set up a development environment, what their microservices look like, how to run their deployments. And with a goal, the ultimate goal being that our SREs have the skills, if they identify a set of actions as a result of an incident, that they can actually go in and contribute back to the individual services through code and pull requests and that sort of thing. And then making sure that we have our call-out groups trained and defined for the incident resolution. And the big part of this is cultural, right? Particularly for us, because we did have a core team that came from the operations background, is making sure they get into the right mindset. And we do that through a combination of things, so leadership coaching, having, your chief architect and your director manager having individual one-on-ones with all the members of the team and providing coaching where necessary. Having regular all-hands meetings to make sure that people understand our strategy, our vision, the development priorities, which things we're focusing on over the next couple of months, making sure that everyone's good with the values, and of course, conducting retrospectives. How are we doing? What have we learned? What can we improve? Basically following Agile. Next slide, please. So this is just a visualization of how we set up our rotational model. So it's not always going to be a black and white situation whether a particular task is implemented by SRE or whether it's implemented by the service development squad. We have a team of SREs that's comprised of our core operations team and sort of the permanent folks like in the leadership team, as well as the engineers who are rotating in. But then there may also be engineers that are in the reporting structure of the individual feature squad that are still nonetheless having to pick up SRE work. There may be more SRE work than the SRE squad itself can commit to, in which case that work has to be implemented by the service squad. So it's very much a partnership between the service development squad and SRE, and sometimes it's a negotiation as to who's going to do what based on what the priorities of the business are. But some typical examples of things that the SRE would be responsible for would be, designing and implementing our automation framework, and having common solutions for logging and metrics, monitoring and reporting, et cetera, where in the service development squad is responsible for designing their systems for high availability. We'll review it with them. We'll review it. We'll make sure that it meets, our standards. But ultimately it's their job to implement that, rate limiting, architecting their application such that it's a shared nothing architecture, stateless, that can facilitate zero downtime deployment, that it's implemented for resiliency and serviceability. Next chart, please. Looks like we're doing okay on time, got a few more minutes. So if you've gotten this far, this is the point at which, you know, we're really ready to take it to the next level and mature our model. What we found worked best was to use a phased implementation model for services. So again, it's going back to expectation setting. All the services expect us to, from day one, to pick up any issue in the repository that has a label of it of SRE. You know, if it's anything to do with security, if it's anything to do with resiliency, if it's anything to do with an outage, they want us to do it. We would love to be at that level with a particular service, but it's a function of how mature is that service and do we have the people to do it. So we don't want to be in the state of saying, no, I can't do that for you because we haven't taken over your service yet, because then it becomes a, we look like the team of no, and we found that we don't want to do that. We want to be the team that says, yes, we can do that for you, and when you get to this particular level of maturity, then we'll even be able to do these other things. So from the very beginning, we call them level 1 and level 2. So any service that we onboard, we can pick up level 1 pretty quickly. We can onboard them with our monitoring frameworks, make sure that we are reporting their availability, measuring and reporting their availability. We can onboard them with our first responder service, make sure that they have good runbooks in place, set up an incident call out rotation. Our incident managers will get on any outage or SWAT call in order to help get the service restored, but we may still call out to their development leads to directly support the service from a technical perspective, and we lead their root cause analysis. So we make sure that the RCA gets scheduled, that it gets tracked, that it goes into the system, that all the action items are properly filed and tracked as well. And then at level 2, we can take it a little bit higher, where we can own the incident management as well as the incident response from a technical perspective, take over their deployments into the production environment, and be responsible for all of their security and compliance, business continuity, and disaster recovery. The other thing that we do is our SMEs who are assigned to a service need to work together with the service squads to do a gap analysis. So that's aligned with our service scorecard, essentially crawling through every one of the microservices of a particular offering and assessing their maturity and assessing their gaps. So for example, are they doing code coverage testing? Are they doing chaos testing? Do they have any single points of failure? Are all their runbooks in place? Have the runbooks been reviewed? But there are a number of different ways to do a scorecard, and a lot of that is stuff that we've taken out of the SRE book. And then from there, once we have that gap analysis, we work together with the squads to define a roadmap of activities that will show them, it gives us a path for how they can get to level 1 and level 2. One of the things that we found, people always want dates. When are you going to take over my service completely? Give me a date. And we have to resist that because it's not date driven. We will take it over when this particular list of gaps has been addressed, and that's a negotiation as well. There may be some that are more important than others. It doesn't always have to be all or nothing, but it does give us sort of some guidelines to go by. And then defining the service level indicators and the service level objectives and how to measure those, and actually monitoring and reporting on the service level indicators. And at that point, we've fully taken it over. So we've got just a couple minutes left. We'll go into the pitfalls. I think that's what's next. Again, a lot of this for us was about managing expectations, making sure that everyone understood what the mission and scope was, that we did the one-on-ones with the individual service squads and got their buy-in, making sure that it's grounded in reality. that we're not able to take on everyone's dirty work, and it doesn't mean that they're completely off the hook from getting called out in the middle of the night, because there's limits on what a team of generalists can do. If there's 20% of us and 80% of the service development squads, there's no way that all of our people are going to be experts in all things in an individual service. It's just humanly impossible. Don't throw an army of engineers at the problem before you have the mission, scope, and backlog defined. So, if you have some structure and plan in place at the time that you bring people on, they're going to appreciate it, because they know what their priorities are. They know what they need to start looking at and start working on. And the executives and peer development managers will appreciate, seeing a roadmap and knowing what the roles and responsibilities are. Crawl, walk, run. It's just make sure you tackle the obvious items first. We were very eager to jump in and start defining SLOs and SLIs from the get-go, but the more urgent thing is take a look at, what is our mean time to recovery? Do we have gaps in our run books? Did we have situations where we didn't know who to call out? Is our process been, refined? Is our survival guide and our documentation complete and in place where people know what to do? So getting those things out of the way it allows you to show early success and make incremental progress. And then over time, we build on that by adding improved metrics collection, adding in more automation and resiliency, because ultimately the goal is to avoid having to call out humans at all. Once you get a human on the phone, you're guaranteed a minimum of anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes of outage time. Whereas if there's an automation that can correct a problem, you can keep that much lower. And of course, practice agile, ruthlessly prioritize the backlog. Next chart, please. Again, making sure that it's not just a rebranding of development operations. SRE is an engineering team. If we have people with a traditional operations background, we're pushing them a little bit, getting them out of the comfort zone, getting them to write some code, learning what the current tools of the trade are, using GitHub, making pull requests, avoiding any kind of us versus them culture. We partner with development. That goes back to our values. Being pragmatic versus purist, but of course still holding on to your principles. So for example, it's not an all or nothing proposition, and we're not going to set the bar and the scorecard so high that it's impossible for any service team to meet that, because that's just a recipe for resentment within the organization. And we also had to recognize this doesn't come for free, right? It's not that we're just going to throw together an SRE team and things magically happen. We had to pull resources out of service development. We had to pare back a little bit on the features. We had to basically say that reliability and availability are our priorities. And that may mean that we take a hit on our short-term velocity when it comes to feature development. But over time, that should get better, because we're preventing future crises. We're paying down technical debt, and that will allow the teams to be able to deliver faster and more frequently once they've reached a certain level of maturity. And of course, make sure that you're adequately staffed, that you have the right engineers with the right skills. And in a rotational model, if you go to a manager and you say, I'm going to take 2 of your people, they're not always going to give you their best. In fact, they likely will never give you their best. And that's okay, but you also want to make sure that they're not sending you the low performers or their misfits either, that you're getting folks who have the right skills in order to make this effort succeed. And next slide, please. Okay, so I'll go through this very quickly. We didn't talk a lot about what we actually do. We host a set of DevOps tools on the cloud as part of Bluemix. We also have a site called the Bluemix Garage Method, where we document a number of practices and cultural guidelines, methodologies related to DevOps and building applications at scale that are born on the cloud and cloud native. So the first one is Garage Method, ibm.com/devops/method. Our tools, next slide please. We have an open tool chain that allows you to provision a collection of tools and repository and build continuous delivery pipeline very quickly based on a template, and also integrate with third parties like Slack and PagerDuty and Sauce Labs and others. If you want to check that out, go to bluemix.net/DevOps. And what we've described is the SRE process that we've implemented for how we actually support these services that we offer and operate. We can skip this one. I think we've used up all the time. So I'll hand it back to Karen.
Thank you, Richie. Thank you, Perry. That's a lot of information, really good information for us. Before we get to the Q&A, I would just like to, for those people that are going to be dropping off quickly, I'd just like to remind everybody that our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, May 18th, when Ann Hangate, President of Daring Systems, joins us, and Ann's presentation is titled DevOps Test Engineering, Putting the Continuous in Testing. And you've heard about continuous integration and continuous delivery, but what's common as code makes its way through those processes? Testing. With DevOps testing, also known as continuous testing, testing tasks are engineered to be continuously completed end-to-end across the entire development and deployment pipeline. Developers, QA analysts, security professionals, IT operations analysts, everyone is a tester in a DevOps environment. So join us to learn more about DevOps testing and the emerging role of DevOps test engineer.